Ooh. Welcome back. Welcome back. You are listening to Lurie Daniel Favors on SiriusXM's Urban View, where talk empowers and becomes action. I am doing this live on Instagram. And am I on Instagram? I'm technically on Instagram, but child, I tell you, something just happened. I don't know what just happened. We're going to do this segment live on Instagram and on YouTube. So YouTube just saw me fuddle around with my live. I'm looking at two different cameras. So it's going to feel like I'm a little cockamamie with my eyes just because I am not sophisticated enough to have this all wrapped up, tied up, and tangled up in one thing. So if it looks like I'm looking up top, it's because I'm looking at the YouTube camera. If it looks like I'm looking down low, it's because I'm looking at the Instagram camera. And if I'm looking straight ahead, it's because I'm looking at the reparations legislation that we are going to discuss today, because we are discussing reparations. And I wasn't even live on Instagram that whole time. I just did that. Child, I just tell you, y'all gonna have to work with a sister today. So as I was telling the audience here at SiriusXM Urban View, shout out to channel 126. Yesterday was another hearing, a business meeting actually, for the New York State Reparations Commission. And it was a very important, all of the meetings are important, but this was an important one for updating the community on where the commission currently is. And those of you who were at the hearing or who watched it, you may know that the commission, unfortunately, got off to a start that was less than auspicious. When I had done this work previously in the New York City Racial Justice Commission, which was a different commission specifically for New York City, by the time we were sworn in as commissioners, we already had an executive director, we had legal team in place, we had staff, researchers in place, everything was already set up for us. And with the New York State Reparations Commission, it was very, very different. We weren't even allowed to speak to each other until we got sworn in. So it's been a super slow process. Like hiring an executive director has taken months. And it's been very, very slow. And so it's really important. And we were able to have this business meeting to talk with the people about why it's taking so long, because there are valid reasons. Like, what y'all doing? What y'all taking so long for? Somebody was like, y'all getting paid to do all. And it's like, first of all, we're not getting paid. This is an unpaid commission. But it was really important that people understand why it is that we are at the process that we are at. Now, let me just say right off the bat, I'm not speaking on behalf of the commission. I am doing what we're about to do. This is a teach-in on the legislation. I, as a member of the commission, do not have the authority to speak on behalf of the commission. And you wouldn't want your commissioners just all willy-nilly speaking on behalf of the commission, because that can be disruptive to the process. So I'm speaking right now as a New Yorker, as somebody who is interested in this legislation, and because I know that in my audience, we have people all across the country who are also thinking about reparations legislation and having these things set up in their states. And so it's important that we analyze not just the good about getting the legislation passed, but also some of the challenges. And there are definitely challenges. So the legislation is multiple pages, not too many, but multiple. And I'm going to read to you from the legislation. It's going to feel a little disjointed because I'm actually going to read things out of order. And that's by design, as opposed to giving you the largest part of the legislation, which is the part that describes why the commission is being formed. I'm going to actually talk with you first about who is covered by the legislation. And then we're going to get into why that is. Okay. So according to Section 3B of this legislation, which starts on page 5, for those of you who have a copy of it, good hello to everybody who's saying hi in the chats. Hi, how are y'all? I hope y'all are great. According to, so we're talking reparations for those of you just joining. But according to Section 3B of the legislation, the duties of the commission, what the commissioners as a body are charged to do, include the following things. The commission is required to examine the institution of slavery that existed within the state of New York and in the city of New York. The commission is supposed to, as a part of that effort, look at a variety of things like the capture and the procurement of African people, the transport of African people to what is now known as New York City and New York State for the purposes of enslavement, including their treatment during transport, the sale and acquisitions of Africans as chattel property in interstate and intrastate commerce, meaning we're supposed to look at, or the commission is supposed to look at, how Black people, enslaved Africans, were transferred across state lines and within state lines. So the geography matters, right? The commission is also charged to look at the treatment of enslaved Africans in the city of New York and the state of New York, including the deprivation of their freedom, the exploitation of their labor, the destruction of their culture, their languages, their religion, and their families, and the treatment of formerly enslaved Africans and their descendants in the city of New York and the state of New York during the period between the Civil War and the present. Now, that's important because up until this part where I got to subsection E, everything that we were talking about that the commission is charged with examining has to do with the treatment of enslaved Africans within the city and state of New York. Starting in subpart E, we are also, or the commission is also charged with looking at the treatment of formerly enslaved Africans and their descendants in the city of New York, in the state of New York, during the period between the Civil War and the present. That means the commission is not just looking at what happened during enslavement. The commission is also charged with looking at what happened after enslavement and which continues until this present day. The commission is also charged with looking at the treatment, is it charged with examining the extent to which the federal government, as well as the state and local governments of New York, supported the institution of slavery, including the extent to which these governments prevented, opposed, or restricted efforts of free enslaved Africans to repatriate to their homeland. Like, y'all didn't just enslave people, you prevented them from even trying to go home. The commission is required to examine how New York State engaged in the interstate transfer of enslaved Africans and carried out federal policies to further the interests of slavery. The commission has to examine the de jure and the de facto discrimination against freed enslaved Africans, their descendants, and people of African descent, generally at the state and federal levels, including the period, again, following the Civil War up until the present, and looking at economic, political, education, and social discrimination. This is all language taken specifically from the legislation. So if you are interested in what the commission is supposed to do, you want to really start with the legislation. Now, a lot of us have perspectives and beliefs and opinions about reparations, what it should look like, who it should go to, and all of that is valid. However, this body is charged with remaining within the four corners of this legislation because that's the power or the authority that has been given to the commission. Continuing on, the commissioners are also supposed to look at examining the lingering negative effects of the institution of slavery and discrimination on living people, meaning people alive today. So we're not stopping with people who passed away. We're continuing to look at what also is continuing to happen to people who are alive today. Recommending appropriate ways to educate the public on the findings of the commission. The commission is supposed to recommend appropriate remedies and reparations. Here's the most important part. The commission is supposed to recommend appropriate remedies and reparations in consideration of the findings of the matters described in everything I just read of the subdivision to determine the following thing. How should the state of New York provide for the appropriate laws, policies, programs, projects, and other recommendations in order to reverse the injuries? These remedies can include compensation, including but not limited to the amount of compensation and who should be eligible for compensation. And the commission is required to examine the feasibility of the creation of a bureau that could assist in the distribution and the administration of the remedies and reparations as recommended by the committee. Now, much ado has been made about the existence of the committee, and I think that's important, or the commission rather, and that's important because you want the commission to be making sure that they are in alignment with the legislation. And one of the things that has become clear over the course of the many hearings that we have had is that there is a lack of understanding as to what the commission does, why it was set up, and for whom. Now, again, you can have whatever perspectives you wish about what reparations are, who they should go to. There was a person who testified who said, if you are from the Caribbean, you should seek your reparations from the Caribbean. CARICOM is working on that for the Caribbean. And I don't think that people who were not enslaved here should get access to reparations. It's a valid point. It's a fair point. Like if you have reparations access points in the Caribbean and that was where your people were enslaved, you should definitely include going to the Caribbean in order to see what they are doing for reparations. I don't think that, I think reasonable people can agree that that makes logical sense. The challenge that we have, however, is that that is not what this particular legislation does. This particular legislation requires us to not just look at those who were enslaved in the state of New York. And let me not even say we, because I'm not speaking on behalf of the commission. This legislation requires that the commission look at what happened to people who were enslaved in New York. It looks at what happened to people who experienced the degradations of slavery and racism in the state of New York during enslavement, and what has happened since. And so if someone, for example, were to have arrived in the state of New York, I don't know, there were several people who said, I'm a part of my roots and my lineage are here only in America. My family left the South after enslavement and came up to New York. And those people, to their knowledge and to their credit, acknowledge that they would not be eligible for consideration under whatever reparations format would come for people who had been enslaved in New York. Now, they would, however, be considered in the subsequent sections of the legislation that require the commission to look at what happened after enslavement. That's how the legislation was drafted. And so, if you disagree with that, that is totally your right to disagree with. If you agree with it, totally your right to agree with it. The challenge we now face is, what do we do now that we're here? And so the reason that the legislation did approach this issue the way that they did was because of the extensive history of enslavement in the state of New York, which went way before New York was an official state. And yesterday we actually heard from some folks who did a nice presentation that explained all that history. I'm not going to go through all that history with you, but if you're curious, that history is laid out in great detail in the first 4.5 pages of the legislation. And Jonah, actually, I want to tweet out the link to the legislation and put it out on Blue Sky and wherever else we're at so that people have access to it directly, because it's really important that people have accurate information. Now, the challenge that we confront ourselves with is, what do we do now? Right. So the commission gathers monthly, typically, more or less. And the idea behind the commission is that they are supposed to hear testimony from people in the community about what the reparations remedies should look like. Yes, we all were chosen because we bring a lot of expertise and information to this process. Some of you may like the people who are on the commission. You may not like the people who are on the commission. That's neither here nor there for this conversation. The conversation we're having now is, what is the point of all of these hearings? And I'm raising this because yesterday at the hearing, it became clear that there is a lot of passion in a lot of folks who believe very strongly in their particular perspectives. The question we have to ask ourselves is the question that Sonia Sanchez poses, which is, how does it free us? Right. So this is the legislation that we have. Now, there were some other versions of the legislation that were entered and debated and voted down before this legislation was passed into law. Some of those pieces of legislation restricted the language of reparations discourse to only those who had been enslaved in the state of New York and their descendants. Those pieces of legislation did not pass into law. People who were fighting for them and advocating for them were not able to convince enough legislators, who are the people we elect either in the state assembly or in the state senate. They were not able to convince enough of those elected officials to support those pieces of previous legislation such that it would have gotten signed into law. So those previous pieces of legislation, it's like this is going to sound crass, it's like a miscarriage. Like they are no longer viable. It's no longer what we are currently dealing with. What we're currently dealing with is the legislation that did get passed into law. And that is the legislation from which I was reading who is covered. Now, the challenge that we face here is we want this process to produce something that is going to be beneficial for the people who are covered by the legislation. We want this reparations conversation to continue to move forward. Again, you may not agree with how it's moving forward, and that is your business. That is your right. But this is where we're at. And so the commission, when it gathers, it has business meetings and it has hearings. Those of you who have watched this, you've been able to see what's happening in those spaces. And what is beginning to happen is a pattern that we should just be aware of, that we should be mindful of. At the end of the commission's process, the commissioners are required to produce a report. And that report is going to have within it recommendations about what New York State legislators should vote on in forms of reparations. So if you think there should be cash payments, you got to let us know that. If you think there should be free housing, you got to let us know that. Now, I'm not at all suggesting we're going to get any of these things. I'm just saying, if you think we should get whatever you think people should get, the people who are covered by the legislation, then you should come to the hearings. You should testify about that. And you have to do so in the following way. And this is important because a lot of times we get up on a microphone and our passion is so palpable and it's so necessary, and it is a beautiful part of who we are. Unfortunately, sometimes our passion can also end up cutting off our nose to spite our face. And here's what I mean. At a commission hearing, you typically have 3 minutes to testify. It might be different in your jurisdiction, but you have 3 minutes to testify. And in those 3 minutes, the commissioners, in order for this to be a very meaningful exchange, the commissioners need to know, what do you think? Number one, what do you understand of the harms of enslavement? And what do you think the reparations commissioners should include in the report that they are going to have to provide to the state legislature at the end of this process? Now, here's the challenge. If you spend the first 90 seconds of your 3 minutes talking about giving glory and honor to God, who is the head of my life, from whence I came to thence I shall go, bringing greetings from my pastor who was at the first missionary Baptist. So if you spend 90 seconds doing that, then you've only got 90 additional seconds to make your substantive point. And so it's really important that by the time you get to the commission hearing, you want to make the most of that time as you possibly can. Here's the other challenge. Remember those other pieces of legislation that I mentioned before? The other pieces of legislation that included some things that a lot of groups wanted and were advocating for, but those pieces of legislation were essentially deaded because they did not have enough votes in the New York State Assembly or the New York State Senate in order to get passed into law. The challenge that can happen is that if you come to a commission hearing to testify about what you want to see in the commission, but you spend your entire 3 minutes talking about the bills that you shoulda, coulda, woulda, wanted to have, then a few things happen. One, you do get on the microphone. Two, you'll probably get applause from people who agree with you. But three, you will have given the commissioners nothing that they can put into the report that would help the commissioners determine what a reparations package should look like. Here's the other challenge. You might really passionately believe that those other pieces of legislation, the ones that did not get passed into law, you might actually absolutely believe that they should have been the law. And you might believe it so strongly, you might believe it so passionately that you get your friends to come with you. You might even form a group, and your group might be very attractive to people. It might feel really good to people. You might be excited about the fact that you have a group, and you might have t-shirts, you might have slogans, you might meet regularly, you might do amazing, wonderful things. And if you and that group of that gives you joy, that you love to be a part of, that allows you to engage, that really empowers you and allows you to feel like you are contributing in meaningful ways, if you and 10 of those members, or you and 100 of those members, or you and 1,000 or 1,000,000 or 5011 billion or 5011 billion D, I don't know, however many people if all the blacks in America were a part of that group, and all 44 million Black people came to testify in front of this commission and said, we don't like that this commission covers all these other groups. We want the commission to only cover the groups that was in the other legislation. Then all 44 million Black people could testify to that point. And you know what it's going to do? Nothing. Because the commission doesn't have the authority to change the legislation. The legislators do. And so even if you come to the hearings and you use up all the time in the community hearings to talk about how much you don't like this legislation, which is the only legislation that is currently on the books, the only legislation for reparations that exists in the state of New York, you can spend all day testifying about how much you wanted this other bill. But the job of the commissioners is to produce a report based on what you, the public, think reparations should look like. So all the time and the energy and the repeated talking points and the spending, hours and hours and hours saying that you don't like that this legislation covers XYZ group and you want it to only cover this group, that I'm sure it feels good in the moment. And like I said, it's going to get you a lot of applause from the other people in the audience who agree with you and who believe like you do, but it will not do anything to change the groups that are covered by the legislation. In order for that to happen, if you wanted to change the groups covered by the legislation, you would have to go back to the legislators. You would have to tell them, hey, y'all got it wrong. I'm glad you got something signed into law, but you got it wrong in our perspective. And we want you to redo it. We want you to either amend the existing legislation that is currently signed into law, or we want you to vote to repeal that legislation, which would cancel it completely, would remove it from being law. And we want you to reintroduce a new bill that will allow the reparations work to only focus on this particular group of people. And then you would just have to do what people do when they want legislation passed. You would go around to the different legislators, both in the Assembly and in the state Senate. You would talk with them. You would meet with them. You would advocate with them. You would communicate with them. You would send them letters. You would give them phone calls. And I'm giving you insight. I'm telling you how to do this. I'm just do with this information what you will. But you would engage with those elected officials and convince them to vote to do either of those options, either repeal this legislation, amend this legislation, and introduce a new piece of legislation that's going to deal specifically with the group that you want. The challenge that we face is that when there are other people in the audience who want to contribute, when I say we, I'm talking New Yorkers. I'm talking people who are showing up at the hearings. If there are people who are going to testify about the things that they want to see in the reparations package, that's the information that the commissioners need, because that's the information that's going to go into the report. If 44 million Black people show up and say, we don't like this legislation, I mean, yeah, that might probably be a footnote in the report. It'll get a paragraph or two of mention that many people showed up and said they didn't like the legislation. But nothing is going to change about what the commission is focused on, because the commission is only focused on what the legislation that is currently in the law, that is currently on the books. That's the only thing the commission has the power to focus on. So if you are at a hearing and the hearing is about something that you don't like and you're very upset, and the commissioners at the hearing, those who are hearing the testimony, respond to the audience to explain to you how this works, it's really self-defeating to then be mad in the audience and yell at the commissioners, "We don't need you to preach to us." No one is preaching. But we have to be clear about what we can and cannot do. No one is preaching, but the audience and the people and the public have to understand what the process is, because there are some people who are a part of other groups and organizations that want to contribute substantive information that is going to actually make its way into the report. And so I really just want to encourage people. Passion is important. Emotion matters so much, and it's one of our superpowers when wielded accurately. But when we are in positions where what we wanted to see get passed into law didn't get passed into law, we want to make sure that we're advocating in front of bodies that can actually do something about it. Because imagine this, let's say there's a law passed that I don't like, and I'm so mad about this law being passed. I go to my neighbor's house. And I go to my neighbor's house and I stage a protest in front of my neighbor's house. The neighbor ain't got no authority to change the law. The neighbor ain't got no capacity to make a change. All they can do is call the elected officials like you can. But I'm going to stage a protest at the neighbor's house, yelling loudly. I'm going to bring all 44 million Black people to loudly demand that we are upset about this legislation. And that will certainly exert some energy. It will certainly, I'm sure, provide feelings of camaraderie. And there's nothing like working with your comrades and being in them streets and feeling like you made an impact. But I recently was told that there is a difference between having impact and having influence. There's a difference between having presence and having power. And if you're yelling at the neighbor's house and the neighbor can't do nothing for what it is that you're yelling about, what good is that? Now, that's a question you have to answer. And it may feel really wonderful to go yell at the neighbor's house. It may feel like you're accomplishing a lot of things. But if the goal that you have is to change the legislation, you're going to have to do something other than yell at the neighbor's house, because the neighbor can't change the legislation. And if you want other legislation to be considered so that you can get what it is that you want, you got to go to the legislators, who are the elected officials, and draft the legislation as you want it, and then negotiate and get enough of them to sign on to support the bill. Once enough of them in the state assembly and in the state house, you got it, and whatever the numbers are in your state, it depends. So you may need a simple majority of the legislators in both of your state houses. You may need a super majority. I don't know what state you live in, so this is just GP. So you need to know, how many votes is it going to need to pass legislation in my state Senate? How many votes am I going to need to pass legislation in my state assembly? How many, if it's a city council legislation, how many votes do I need in the city council to pass this legislation? There are practical things that can be done to move needles forward legislatively. But camping out in front of your neighbor's house, that ain't one of them. And you can feel free to yell as much as you want. And I shouldn't say yell, because that sounds a little pejorative. I don't want for any of this to be pejorative. You can utter from the belly of your soul. You can you can be impassioned. You can be meek and mild and quiet. However you present is up to you. But if you're going to participate in the process, it's important to know what the process can and can't do. And it's important to consider, is this the best use of the capacity, seeing as yelling at the neighbor's house, while again, feels good. The matching shirts look amazing. The djembe drums beating sounded wonderful. And it's empowering to just be in one accord. And sometimes that umoja, that unity, it just feels amazing just to have us on one accord. And sometimes, we value that more than we value effectiveness. Do with that information what you will. So again, there are ways of getting things done. There are ways to sabotage what has already been done. And people have to decide how it is they're going to move forward. But the reality is, it is important for us to understand how we got to this process. The legislation is there to be read. And I'm actually going to suggest that the legislation be read at the beginning of every future hearing, so that people understand why, whom and on what basis the work of any commission is being done. 866-801-8255, 866-801-TALK is the number. I don't even know how this looked because I couldn't look at the screen, and so I don't know who was chatting. I don't know what's going on. But thank y'all for listening. I'm going back to Urban View now. We're going to take some phone calls. 866-801-8255. And again, we're going to tweet out this legislation because it's really important that we have as much accurate information as we possibly can about how to move forward. There is nothing worse than, quite frankly, just being misinformed and moving in ways that can end up sabotaging us and cutting ourselves off at the knees when it's not. We don't have to do that. We may not agree. You may not like it, and that is okay. I respect your right to feel as passionately about things as you do. But it's also important that we understand how the system works and we understand the limitations of the systems in which we're operating, and then do with that what we will. So we're going to end this stream here. Hold on, let me make sure I did this right. Okay, bye YouTube. All right, I think I've ended it. Bye Instagram.